combined to pressure Parliament to introduce factory acts that would limit the amount of hours and improve the conditions that women and children could work in factories. And so you had a whole series of factory acts in 1819, 1833, 1842, 1847, 1850, and they don't stop after that. It's just I'm going to run out of time if I keep going. But we shouldn't assume that women and children are taken out of the factory by those factory acts. What they do is basically reduce the hours of work and the conditions in which they labour. And indeed, work was vital for the support, women and children working was vital for the support of most working class households. Most working class households would have been confined to workhouses if they didn't have the additional incomes of their women and children. Now the ideal was that women would work until they got married, that working class women would work until they would get married, and at that point the daughters' wages would go into household funds. And the idea was that after marriage you carried on working, but you did so on a part-time basis, so that you would take on occasional homework or needlework in the domestic setting. But unmarried women worked predominantly in two areas. In the new textile industries, which accounted for something like 22% of all women's employment by the middle of the 19th century, and the other most important sector, and often overlooked, was domestic service. Domestic service was by far the biggest form of employment for unmarried working class girls. Something like 40%, accounted for something like 40% of women's employment. And domestic service was seen to be a respectable form of labour because it was in a domestic environment. In a way, it was a form of labour that helped enshrine the family ideal, not challenge it. There were other forms of employment that were very important to women. The clothing industry was very important, and so too was seasonal agricultural work. But a good deal of women's work was made simply invisible because it was not recorded. So a good example of this is that the 1881 census, which recorded the occupations of the population, excluded most categories of work that women did. So there was no recording of seasonal agricultural work, no recording of private domestic work, i.e. taking in someone's laundry or cleaning someone's house, no recording of needlework that you would do in the household for a manufacturer. Now, women weren't just involved actively in production. They were also consumers and workers in the new retail spaces that developed in the second half of the 19th century, retail spaces that developed primarily to sell the clothes and household goods that women were often actively involved in making. And one of the interesting things here is the ways in which these new retail spaces were developed in ways that would try and make them safer and more comfortable for women to negotiate. And so the best example here is the development of the Regent Street area that you see here, the Regent Street and Oxford Street area in central London, and the laying in of the London Underground, both happening in the 1860s. But these were environments where women were meant to be able to move around the city unchaperoned, unaccompanied by a mother or by a man. And along Regent Street, what you had was the big new department stores opening up. Places like Selfridges and, Whiteley's actually wasn't on Regent Street, but a whole series of new department stores that developed, and many of which are still there when you go to do your shopping in London if you want to spend a fortune. One of the interesting things about those department stores is that they try to recreate a domestic environment for women. They try to make the retail space as domesticated as possible. So the department stores had lots of different departments, each of which a lady customer could be served by a shop girl who would act and dress much like a domestic servant. So the dynamics of the middle-class family household was reproduced and relocated to these retail spaces, which also had their own bathrooms or toilets for women, so they wouldn't have to get caught short on the street. So an important way in which women begin to move out into public spaces, albeit in specially sanctified ways. We should remember also that retail work becomes a very important form of women's employment. So the largest department store in Britain by 1890 was Whiteley's, which employed 6,000 staff and operated its own female dormitories. So it's rather like a type of domestic service. Instead of going to an aristocratic estate, you would go to the department store and they would house you in a dormitory, where there were 176 rules about appropriate forms of dress and behaviour, and working hours that ran from 7 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. And lastly, the other way in which women begin to move out into these public spaces in new types of ways was through the development of charity work. So the growing concerns with the social conditions of cities and of the moral condition of its poor inhabitants created a new area of voluntary charitable action, which was primarily given over to respectable women to pursue. It was seen as an extension of women's work as morally pure guardians of children to be morally pure guardians of the poor and the immoral. You can see this even happening in the early anti-slavery movements where women are involved, and in the temperance movement from the 1830s. But it accelerates dramatically in the second half of the 19th century, so that by the 1890s there are 500,000 voluntary women charity workers. That's an amazing thing, and obviously in order to do work voluntary you have to have a sizable household income to be able to do that. In addition, there were 20,000 salaried charity workers that were now operating the new types of positions created by the state. So you would have district nurses, you would have sanitary inspectors, education officers, and increasingly teachers. There were 170,000 women teachers by 1901. So the social problems that were seen to be a product of the bad things about liberal political economy created a new platform for women to emerge as public professionals in the second half of the 19th century. Let me talk now about the ultimate condemnation of the entire system, which was the position of prostitutes, of so-called fallen women. Now, prostitution had always been around, but it became increasingly visible and problematic from the 1850s. And there's a reason for that. It's because prostitution was basically liberalism's ultimate horror. It dramatized the way in which market forces and depraved, debased moral and social conditions had led women to pursue this most degraded of all occupations. It was estimated that there was one prostitute for every 12 adult males, or 36 inhabitants in London in the 1850s. London had a population then of about just over 2 million. The police estimated it had 27,000 prostitutes operating, but historians have argued that that figure was probably double. It was closer to 55 or even 60,000 prostitutes. And prostitutes were, then as now, usually women of a certain age, between 16 and 22, usually doing it as a transitory job because they'd fallen through bad times, had lost their employment, had been abandoned by parents or by a lover, had lost their job, had run away from home, had moved cities and not been able to establish themselves effectively in their new place. Fallen women prostitutes became targets of intervention in a variety of ways. There was a good deal of voluntary private endeavour. So Charles Dickens, one of the things that Charles Dickens did was to create a house for fallen women. William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, was famous for walking the streets trying to rescue fallen women at night. And there were any number of numerous emigration schemes set up to try and enable prostitutes to start a new life in a new world, primarily in Canada, Australia and New Zealand. But from the 1860s, prostitutes became the determined target of the state, not a voluntary endeavour. And they did so primarily because of military concern, of martial concerns about the high rate of venereal disease in the British military. Venereal disease, which was thought to weaken the state of British men following two catastrophic wars for the British, in which the British Army was pretty much humiliated. The Crimean War and the so-called mutiny in India in 1857. 1 in 3 soldiers were thought to have venereal disease, but it was thought to be inappropriate to inspect soldiers to clarify whether indeed they were whether they had VD. It was thought to be demoralising for soldiers. So instead, the attention shifted not to soldiers but to the prostitutes in garrison towns. So in 1864, this new act, the Contagious Diseases Act, is introduced that enables prostitutes to be forcibly inspected if they're suspected of having a venereal disease and locked up in a hospital, a so-called lock hospital, for 3 months. And forcible inspection was with a steel speculum. It was a grotesque and painful procedure. 1866, the Contagious Diseases Act allowed the inspection of prostitutes every 2 weeks, an intensification of that process. And in 1868, prostitutes now have to carry identity cards, and their period in lock hospitals was extended to 9 months, and that was extended also beyond just the garrison towns. Now, these acts caused an outcry, and they most famously by the figure of Josephine Butler, who established the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act in 1869. Butler led the campaign against the acts, and she did so on 2 grounds. First, she argued that they characterised the double standard of the ideology of separate spheres. They exposed that double standard by punishing women for men's sexual desires, which were then legitimated it. So, by inspecting prostitutes, by making prostitutes a target, not their male customers, they legitimated male sexual desire. And, of course, men's sexual desire made the angels in the home vulnerable to the spread of venereal disease. Women were not being protected in the home if their men were unable to keep their desire in check and would come back with venereal disease. So she argued it was men, not women prostitutes, that were the source of moral corruption and degradation, and it was they who should be punished, not women. The second criticism was of the force of state intervention into literally the most private recesses of the human body. This, Butler said, this use of the steel speculum, this forcible inspection of women through their vaginas, represented the ultimate violence of the liberal state. No state should have the power to be able to violate the sanctity of a citizen's or a subject's body. And in that sense, the campaign was very similar to responses to the introduction of compulsory vaccination and immunisation, which also began in the 1860s. The anti-contagious diseases movement was not vast. Between 1870 and 1885, it held something like 900 meetings. It gathered over 17,000 petitions and collected in total 2.5 million signatures. That's not huge, 2.5 million signatures over 15 years. But it did succeed in having the Contagious Diseases Act repealed in 1886. And more importantly, it established those 2 areas of critique that would become hugely important for the women's suffrage movement later on. I don't have time to talk to you about W.T. Stead and the tribute of modern Babylon. That will have to come in a later lecture because we should finish off by talking about the rise of the women's movement. Now, I'm going to talk to you about this in three ways. The case for women's suffrage, for women getting the vote, was made on 2 grounds. One was based upon the claim for equality, that women were the same as men, they were rational and propertied and therefore deserved the same rights as men. The other was made on the basis of arguing that women were different from men, and their difference would make a difference. That women deserved the vote because they could bring different qualities to bear on the political process, and the political process needed those different qualities. I'm going to explain both of those, and then we'll finish off by talking about how women got the vote. I keep promising to slow down in my lectures, and it hasn't happened yet. But I think I'm getting there. So first, the case for equality. I said at the beginning of the lecture that in many ways the women's movement was a product of liberal political theory. And what it sought to do was simply to expand the terms of the liberal political theory first articulated by Locke. What it sought to do was to make the constitutional case for the equality of women. And that happened in a variety of ways around 2 key ideas. Reason, to establish that women were rational, and to argue that women should also be propertied. The 2 key features necessary for citizenship in the liberal political system. So with Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, remember her argument for the necessity of the education of women against Rousseau, had of course first began to articulate the case for women's rational faculties and their development. But in many ways those arguments are in limbo until the 1850s, when you have the development of the Langham Place Circle, a select group of sort of gentry women, and the publication of the English Women's Journal. A key figure here was Harriet Taylor, the wife of John Stuart Mill, who had written the pamphlet called The Enfranchisement of Women in 1851, but hadn't dared publish it under her own name, so it went out under the name of John Stuart Mill. It provided basically the gist of the argument that Mill would rehash under his own name again in the Subjection of Women in 1869. The Langham Place Circle basically pushed for the legal and educational rights of women, the rights of women for equality before the law, equality in terms of property, more equitable divorce mechanisms, and access to education and the professions. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 created divorce courts for the first time. Before that, you could only get divorce by an act of parliament, so basically it was confined to the aristocracy. Even this Act of 1857 was highly restrictive. Divorce could only be established on the grounds of adultery plus bigamy, cruelty, and desertion. They also lobbied successfully for women's ability to own, married women's ability to own property, and two pieces of legislation resulted from that: the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and 1882. And it's in the 1870s that Oxford and Cambridge colleges, Oxford and Cambridge University begins to open women's colleges, and the British Medical Association begins to open up for women to become doctors. The Law Society doesn't open up until 1919, but basically education and the professions begin to open up as a consequence of those campaigns. Now, I don't want you to think that the women's movement was just a bunch of genteel ladies in a rather sophisticated address in London and Langham Place. It wasn't. It was also about women in movement, on the streets, making a pain of themselves, because that's how you get things done. You remember from the lecture on Tuesday that the big reform was in many ways the Reform Act of 1867. As that bill was being debated, women began to gather a petition for the women's vote to be included in that. John Stuart Mill was one of the key figures involved there. They collected a rather derisory 1,500 signatures for that petition, but it was presented by Mill, who was an MP at that point, and he even moved an amendment to the 1867 Act to remove the phrase male persons only from the bill, which was obviously roundly defeated. But women voters do begin to emerge after 1867. Primarily, this begins to happen in local school board elections after 1870. And from 1895, women are allowed to hold office in local offices as poor law guardians and as members of the school board. So from 1870, they begin to vote in local elections for school board elections. That's the first place that women get to vote in Britain. And by 1900, you can see 1 million women are voting in these local elections for poor law guardians after 1895 and school boards from 1870. But the key organisation that leads the campaigns for women's vote isn't established until 1887, and it's the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and its leader is Millicent Fawcett. And the argument, the tactics of the NUWS was to make the constitutional case for equality by moral force, by demonstrating the force of numbers in support of women's enfranchisement. Now, the NUWS was closely linked to the Liberal Party down until 1912, when it breaks with the Liberal Party and switches its alliance to the Labour Party. It had, by 1914, 100,000 members. The other wing of the women's suffrage movement were those that argued for not the equality of women, but for the difference of women, and the difference of women being important to be incorporated into the political process. And this is where the influence of Josephine Butler and her criticisms of the double standard and the violent nature of the liberal state become really important. The Women's Political and Social Union, I always get this wrong, I can never remember whether it's the Women's Social and Political Union or the Women's Political and Social Union, but someone out there it's SPU, Women's Social and Political Union, not the way that I have it down here, was formed in 1903. It broke away from the NUWSS, and it did so around a more militant strategy of campaigning and a more radical critique of the illiberal nature of the state and of masculine power.